This is our Ruyer reading group back from a couple weeks of break. We're continuing our reading of Cybernetics and the Origin of Information, starting at the beginning of chapter 7, which is page 113 of the translation. Maybe just a sort of high-level overview of what we saw in chapter 6. So that chapter was about this notion of anti-chance and like the different sort of kinds of anti-chance, negative and positive anti-chance. And so anti-chance, of course, is just sort of in general, some sort of outcome of a process or event or whatever that a priori seems unlikely to occur. So sometimes when you know more about the situation, you can determine that actually this seemingly unlikely event was like the only possible event or was very likely to happen because of other factors in the situation that you weren't aware of before. But sometimes it's just for whatever reason you can't find a sort of explanation for why this unlikely event happened. So you can think of like, I think I've used this example a few times where like you find a coin on the sidewalk and you want to figure out, is this coin a fair coin or is it rigged in some way, and you flip it 1,000 times because you're a very patient and systematic person, and the coin comes up heads 1,000 times in a row. So I think most of us would take that as pretty strong evidence that this coin is not actually fair, that it's biased in some way, that the distribution of the mass in the coin is such that it always lands with heads up, or there could be some sort of elaborate system of wires that's actually controlling the flip of the coin that you didn't realize was there, whatever. There's some sort of mechanism, whether it's within the coin or outside the coin, that is ensuring that it always lands heads. So this is a case of positive anti-chance, because there's some sort of positive element of the situation that brings about this result that would otherwise be unlikely. And so Ruyer talks about like pipes as sort of his like general kind of instance of this type of positive anti-chance, where if you have like some sort of fluid circulating around or just sort of in a tank or a cistern or whatever, the direction of flow of that fluid will just be determined by like the gradient of what is the slope of the walls of this tank or of the rim of the tank or whatever. But then if you put a pipe somewhere connected to this tank, then the fluid will not just flow randomly in whatever direction, but will flow through this pipe. Like the walls of the pipe will prevent the molecules of this fluid from passing through the walls, for example, and will make the fluid flow in the direction of the pipe, using whether it's like gravitational force or air pressure or something like that. So this pipe sort of all the possible directions in which the fluid could flow, the pipe sort of confines the flow to one of those directions. It sort of selects this one direction out of many possible directions. And so if you think of like dumping a bucket of water on the ground with no pipe present or no channel or anything, then any one of those directions would be very unlikely. Like whichever direction it ends up flowing in there's a low probability that it would flow in that direction. But then if you have like a pipe or a channel that you pour the bucket of water into, then that pipe or channel ensures that outcome that would otherwise be unlikely to occur is the only outcome that can happen, or is the most probable outcome that can happen. And then so the question, I think, is like, to what extent can we understand the goal-directed behavior of living organisms, or the apparently goal-directed behavior of living organisms, and in particular, the consciously directed behavior of humans? To what extent can we understand this sort of selection of one behavior out of many a priori possible behaviors as analogous in some way to the way that the pipe kind of selects one direction of flow of water out of all the other directions that could be possible? And Ruyer, of course, thinks that these are not really comparable in the sense that the pipe, of course, pre-exists the flow of water that it directs. That like you can only use a pipe to control the flow of water if you have the pipe first and then the water flows through it. Whereas in the case of behavior, there may be like there are sort of analogous, I guess, structures of behavior that are like a pipe in the sense that they're sort of preset. So you can think of things like, riding a bike, tying your shoes, brushing your teeth, etc. You have these sort of like set motor patterns that you've learned, and you can sort of execute without thinking about it, or they're just sort of automatic. So in that sense, they're like analogous to a pipe. They're preset and pre-existing before the behavior actually sort of executes this pattern. But we also have much more flexible and open-ended behavior in the sense that we can, encounter a situation that we've never encountered before and sort of figure out how to achieve a certain goal using whatever is present in that situation. And there's no reason to suppose, and there's actually a lot of reason not to suppose that there's some kind of pre-existing pattern that we're just sort of engaging or triggering to perform that action. And so one of the examples, it wasn't in this chapter, but he brought it up, I think much earlier in the book, is some of these experiments that have been done on monkeys where they swap the connections of the eye muscles so that the muscle that used to connect to the right side of the eye is now being connected to the left side and vice versa, which means that when the monkey is like observing an object moving from left to right across its visual field, normally it would move its eye to track this object. The eye would move from left to right, but now with the muscles inverted, the same contraction of muscles that previously would have moved the eye from left to right and track the object now makes the eye move in the opposite direction. But it turns out that actually when you do this sort of grotesque experiment, that the monkeys actually adapt fairly quickly so that their eyes now do track the object properly, even though their muscles are inverted, which means that the opposite pattern of contraction of muscles has to happen to bring about the same movement of the eye. So here it's obviously there's no reason to suppose, and it seems extremely improbable that there's some sort of like preset circuit in the brain, prepared just in case the monkey's eye muscles get inverted somehow. Rather, it's the pretty clear conclusion to draw here is that the monkey is somehow capable of adapting to this completely unnatural and unlikely to occur scenario of inverted eye muscles, and so here there's nothing like this preset pipe that sort of leads the behavior down this path of moving the eye correctly despite the inverted muscle connections. There's something more mysterious, I guess, than a pipe, or there's some sort of like adaptation learning process that goes on that allows the monkey to adapt to this novel situation in a flexible way and in a way that achieves a goal, in this case a very sort of low level goal just of tracking an object through its visual field. But of course you can sort of extend this idea to more longer term projects, especially in the case of humans, where you can have like a months or years long project involving flexible adaptation to circumstances as they come up. You can think of something like building a house. You might have a plan at the outset, but you don't have like every single movement of your muscles over the course of building that house over several months is not going to be sort of pre-planned. You have to adapt to okay, where did I put the hammer? This piece of wood is rotten, so I have to throw it out. It's like you just sort of adapt to things that come up as you work through this plan, and then keeping in mind sort of the bigger goal, and then you sort of break it down into subtasks and perform those subtasks over the as you go along, while adapting to things that come up through that process. So for all these reasons, or because of this general sort of capacity for flexible adaptation to novelty, I guess he's arguing that we can't understand this. We can't understand the sort of goal directedness in living organisms in terms of some sort of preset direction analogous to a pipe flow, the flow of fluid through a pipe. And then the other sort of side to this, or the other argument for this position, has to do with embryogenesis, or like the origin of these like preset patterns. And of course, if you want to understand where pipes come from, those pipes can't those pipes have to come from somewhere, and the pipes are not themselves the product of pipes. Or to maybe put it in a clearer way, that like you might have certain preset mechanisms that exist, or these preset structures that exist within the adult organism. So like, a joint is like a lever. It's a kind of machine. But when you start from the embryo, the fertilized egg that is the origin of this organism, those machines are not there. That somehow this sort of undifferentiated or largely undifferentiated egg takes on differentiation into these machines, like a lever, a membrane pump, for example. All these different mechanisms, the billions of intricate mechanisms that make up an organism. But the process through which a mechanism is arises or is formed in an organism is not itself mechanical. And so this is like a kind of regress argument, I guess, that like at some point we have to get to something that is like not itself a machine, that is capable of forming machines. Yeah, this is a quote that Angus has put in the chat. So this is from his other book, Genesis of Living Forms. He says, nature does not have a nervous system from which it forms nervous systems. As Plotinus said, it needs no hands with which to make hands. Yeah, exactly. That's a perfect sort of encapsulation of this. So like a nervous system is in some sense a machine. It sort of ensures that different elements of the body are connected in certain ways, that, like, for example, muscles will contract at a certain time and not others. So it's sort of selecting this one event that otherwise would be unlikely to occur. But the formation of that nervous system is not itself a machine, or is not itself the product of a machine. So you need, if you were to try to explain the nervous system's formation in terms of like some like meta nervous system, this sort of like meta machine that forms it, then you would just sort of push the question back one step, and then you would need to explain how that machine is formed, etc. So we need to at some point to have something that is not itself a machine, that sort of accounts for the formation of the machines that we do observe in the organism as it results from this process of development. And maybe I'll just mention briefly that the connection here to cybernetics is that a lot of the cyberneticians were sort of trying to account for a lot of these, the basic idea of cybernetics was precisely to use to treat machines and living beings as being organized under the same principles. So like the starting point for this was was feedback as a machine design principle, that like Norbert Wiener, for example, had worked on these anti-aircraft guns where the airplane that you're trying to shoot down is moving faster than a human can adapt to target accurately. So like if you just try to track the airplane with a gun that is being aimed by a human targeter, the human targeter will aim at where the airplane is, and then by the time the gun is fired and the shell reaches that location, the plane will have moved on to a different one. So you have to actually target not where the plane is, but where it will be when the shell reaches that location. And so there has to be some sort of like mechanical assistance to the human operator to ensure that the targeting, like the sort of deviation from the target is sort of fed back into the targeting mechanism, so that it actually reduces the deviation and hits the target. And so this sort of general like model is taken to is sort of used in explaining animal and human behavior. And so like in the book Cybernetics, Wiener points out that these sort of feedback mechanisms, if they aren't adjusted properly, can produce a kind of oscillation where like a small deviation to the right of the target leads the feedback mechanism to swing to the left, too far to the left, past the target, and then that you try to correct that deviation to the left, and it swings too far to the right again, and so you have this sort of oscillation. And he compares this to the tremors that you find in Parkinson's patients, and so he thinks we can sort of explain both of these things in using similar principles. So this is kind of like an example of the kinds of arguments and explanations that were presented in cybernetics. And I think, like, I don't know if Ruyer actually addresses that specific example, but I think for him, he would see that this as a kind of, because this is a pathological case, it's a kind of, breakdown of a machine or a mechanism that does exist in regulating human behavior, but that doesn't sort of tell us about, that doesn't really inform us about the principles governing goal-directed behavior in a healthy person. That, like, this mechanism is necessary for that goal-directed behavior. Being able to pick up the coffee cup, for example, but just the capacity to grab a coffee cup without tremors that make it spill is not itself an explanation for the fact that a person does pick up the coffee cup. There's an infinite number of behaviors that we're capable of performing that we don't actually end up performing. So that there's still a lot that has to be explained, that just looking at these sort of mechanisms, even these more sophisticated ones that include feedback and so on, doesn't explain, or that it doesn't fully explain. So that's sort of where this connects to cybernetics. Okay, so that's sort of where we are in the book. Angus, would you like to pick up from the beginning of chapter 7?
Yeah, for sure. Chapter 7, Past, Future, and Cybernetics. If we could isolate the various types of connections, time would be completely different depending on the type considered in its pure form. Mechanical connections, such as sliding connections, which allow indefinite and reversible functioning, would belong to an indefinitely reversible time. Macroscopic dynamic connections belong to a time that is reversible and endlessly oscillating. Edge-to-edge connections in a crowd, that is, the absence of general connections in the crowd considered as a whole, lead to maximum disorder and belong to an irreversible time whose quote-unquote limit platform is maximum homogeneity in an indefinite absence of time. Informative connections of conscious action move in an irreversible time and also lead, in the case of an individual and isolated conscious action, to a quote-unquote limit and an indefinite absence of time once the action has reached its optimal. 2 points are noteworthy. The first is that no type of connection in pure form provides the type of ordinary experience, which is irreversible, continuous, and without. This ordinary time is necessarily a quote-unquote compound. The second point is the curious resemblance between the time of crowds and the time of conscious action. Both are irreversible and have a quote-unquote extreme in one case, optimal in the other. Both have, according to Eddington's expression, a quote-unquote arrow. Relative to information, these arrows always have a determined orientation, since the information is minimum at the limit of crowd time and maximum at the limit of conscious action. It is their relationship that we must study now, because the similarity of these two times has deceived cyberneticians. According to Wiener's thesis, information machines, unlike clockwork machines, would exist in an authentic time, just like living beings with a past and future that is irreversible. They would exist in the time of J.W. Gibbs's statistical machines rather than in the time of classical mechanics. They would even exist, according to in Bergsonian time. It is already strange that this thesis is diametrically opposed to Schrödinger's thesis. According to the latter, the conservation of information by organisms requires comparison to a molecule at absolute zero, where entropy is zero, or to a clockwork that would function without any friction and thus preserve its order completely. Finally, Wiener is not perfectly clear about the relationship he establishes between the time of heat engine and the time of information. He brings them together to oppose them to the reversible time of Newtonian mechanics, while also opposing them to each other. He naturally brings them together because, as we have seen, entropy and information are antithetical and symmetrical notions. He opposes them because a heat engine works by degrading energy, whereas a feedback automaton uses information in its very function, from quote-unquote input to quote-unquote output, without quote-unquote consuming it. Since this is kind of an introduction, maybe I'll go ahead and start the next section. The fantasy of inverted times. Wiener first notes, very ingeniously, that we cannot observe or communicate with a system other than our own unless the direction of time is the same in the observed system and the observing system. The very fact that we see a star means that its thermodynamics is similar to ours. Indeed, we perceive the light that comes toward us and reaches our eye or photographic plate. We can see stars that emit light, but we could not see stars that might, quote, radiate backward, that is, absorb light. We know our past, but not our future. Retinas or photographic plates can only perform their role if they receive information emanating from the star at a present moment whose past is not contaminated by a disorder of the past future. If we had anticipatory images or pre-images, as we have residual images or after images, vision, like photography, would be very difficult. If we wanted to communicate with a being whose time went backward compared to ours, it would be impossible for us to perceive their informative messages as messages. Suppose this being B wants to send us a square as a message or signal by tracing it in the sand. As our time would be hypothetically the opposite of his, we would first see it at moment lowercase a for us and lowercase b prime for him, weak indistinct traces, which would then become a square, is a prime for us and lowercase b for him. This square would suddenly disappear for us at our moment lowercase a, corresponding to the instant lowercase, it's our moment lowercase a prime, corresponding to instant lowercase b where b, capital B, traced it. But since we would have seen the square form itself gradually and spontaneously according to our past future, we would attribute its formation to natural causes, and therefore it would not resemble a signal at all to us. Its sudden disappearance would also appear to us as a natural catastrophe. Yeah, so he is drawing a distinction between irreversible and reversible actions, and then two different kinds of irreversible action, one of which is entropic, and the other one, I think the point is that conscious action, the result of a conscious action is more structured than the state in which the conscious action began, whereas crowd phenomena are less ordered from, time 0 to time 1. And I think he's arguing that the cyberneticians haven't adequately distinguished two kinds of reversible. And the idea of the message from the future, which shows up first of all in these faint material traces, which appear to accrue by natural processes into a kind of form, which was the message from the future. I think that he's going to argue that this kind of observed mechanical accretion instantiating a form which has higher order, so to be a lucis naturae, as he puts it, from our perspective, is analogous to a form of living beings or of gestures and behaviors of psychic systems.
Yeah, so this has to do with what's sometimes called the thermodynamic arrow of time. And so this is a concept that is supposed to explain why it is that there's a sort of irreversibility in time, whereas in, for example, Newtonian physics, time is reversible. So if you take some equations of motion that represent, for example, the orbits of the planets in the solar system, and you just reverse the sign of the time variable, so this would be running the system backwards. The reversed sign system is still a perfectly valid Newtonian system. It doesn't happen to correspond to our solar system, but there's no reason in the Newtonian physical theory for why there couldn't be a solar system that is exactly the same as ours, except running in the opposite direction. And this is, of course, completely different than the kinds of processes we observe in our own everyday life. You can think of an organism growing into adulthood, or a piece of paper burning, or whatever, and all these sorts of processes are irreversible. We never observe a pile of ashes just sort of spontaneously recomposing into an unburned piece of paper, for example, or a ball rolling uphill without anyone pushing it uphill, or some sort of force pushing it uphill. And so in thermodynamics, or in this sort of account of the arrow of time, this difference between past and future would have to do with the increase of entropy. So this is the increase of disorder in a system. So the arrow of time would be just the direction in which entropy increases. And then, yeah, so Ruyer points out that the directedness that we attribute to, goal-directed action or purposed action is, in some sense, the opposite of this directedness of increasing entropy, where you can think of, like, I forget the details of his example, but if you think about, like, say, a deck of cards, you have someone who is, like, taking the deck of cards and sorting it by suit or by number or whatever exactly, some sort of attributing some pattern to the cards. Here, this person is bringing about a greater order of this set of cards. Whereas if you were to just shuffle them randomly, of course, the whole point of shuffling is to increase the entropy to make the sequence of cards more disorderly. And so the goal-directed action in general is introducing order where that order did not previously exist. And so this idea that there's like a opposite direction of the entropy increasing disorder, this thermodynamic arrow of time, and then the ordering, the increase of ordering, or this structuration that happens in the case of goal-directed action. So this might suggest to us that maybe these are just sort of like the opposite of each other, that there's a sort of reversed, like a counter-entropic process that we can find in goal-directed behavior. And that turns out not to be maybe exactly right. So this is what this bit about the inverted times shows us. So Wiener, points out that it's already, if we suppose that there were, say, like some sort of mirror universe where entities would exist with the opposite arrow of time compared to ours, it would be hard to understand how we could ever interact with this universe or communicate with whatever equivalent of an intelligent being that might exist in this universe. And so he gives this example of supposing that these entities were trying to transmit the image of a square to us. So they say draw a square in the sand on a beach or something like that. For us, because the direction of time is the opposite of ours, we would see some sort of process of like this sort of gradual process of formation of a square in the sand, and then the sudden like disappearance of that square afterwards. But because everything would be gradual in the formation, the formation part would just look like some sort of natural process, maybe a kind of surprising and rare one, where a square is not something we sort of expect to see just spontaneously appear on a beach. But if we were to like look at it closely, we would see some sort of interactions of forces bringing about the formation of this square, and then we'd say, oh, there's some process that we had never encountered before, but it's just this natural phenomenon of sand square formation, and so because we would perceive this formation of the square as this natural phenomenon, it would be hard to sort of conclude that there's actually this intelligence operating with a reversed arrow of time behind the formation of this square. And so Ruyer is going to go on in the next little bit that we get to after this section, to sort of criticize this argument. But it at least shows that that you can't just sort of explain goal-directed behavior by reversing the sign of a thermodynamic process of increasing entropy. That this sort of gradual formation of a square through some sort of process, some sort of physical process that we would see if we were to suppose that there's this reverse time arrow intelligence trying to communicate with us, is not the same thing as the sort of reversed sign thermodynamic process. So the thermodynamic process of increasing entropy is not just a reversed sign of the goal-directed behavior, or vice versa. There's something about goal-directed behavior that is distinct from thermodynamic processes other than just this different direction. 61, would you like to read the next page or so? Okay, no worries. Yeah, I can read the next bit. I'll go to the section heading. if you're available, you can do the next one after that. Okay. This fantasy of Wiener's does not exactly prove what he wants it to prove. Suppose, in fact, that instead of a simple square, whose progressive formation could, at a stretch, be seen as a crystallization or a lusus naturae, B sends a very complex message comprising numerous printing characters. Even in these circumstances, it would take a certain amount of bad faith not to understand the message as a message. Right. The fantasy of inverted time is less fantastic than Wiener imagines. Without inverting thermodynamic time, consciousness at least surveys it, and for large stretches of time is not confined to the present moment. Leaving aside the hypothesis of inversion, let us consider B as an ordinary conscious being whom we observe. It will happen very often that from A to A prime, we will progressively surmise the intentions of B, beginning with a vague presentiment and ending with a precise perception. If B is hostile to us, we may sense his hostility through sign effects, S prime, S double prime, I guess is what this is supposed to be. It's not very... typesetting here is an issue. Anyway, side effects which are very slight but nevertheless decipherable to a psychoanalyst. These side effects emanating from the intentions or complexes of B in some sense go back up the stream of time for us and even potentially for him if he is unconscious of his latent hostility. They go back up for him, or at least they emanate from a source S, timeless or super timeless relative to the stretch of time under consideration. I wonder if super timeless here should actually be like super temporal or something. I'll have to check that. In invention also, it often happens that the inventor divines through sign effects a still hidden idea of which he has, in some sense, quote unquote, pre-images and not after images. The first imperfect sketches, ébauches, arrive before the clear realization, exactly as in Wiener's fantasy, the half-erased square is perceived by A before the clearly traced square. A metaphysician would even be entitled to use the schema of the two inverted times, or of two times of which one is more, quote, surveyed by consciousness, unquote, than the other, to interpret the evolution of living species according to a cosmic or theological purpose. This evolution seems to have natural causes, mutations, selection, adaptation, and so on. Consequently, those with a positivist spirit refuse to see a meaning, an idea behind organic forms and their evolution. But perhaps it is the same illusion due to the same inversion or the same lag between our time and that of the demiurge or élan vital, which makes A interpret the square traced by B as a natural crystallization or a lusus naturae, even though it is quote-unquote meaningful. In any case, it is undeniable that a simple change in temporal rhythm often makes it difficult to understand or even recognize a meaningful message. Conversely, a lost meaning can be recovered by changing an inappropriate rhythm. In sped-up cinema, the groping movements of tendrils or the blooming of flowers appear surprisingly intentional. And there is no proof that it is not the rhythm of cinema that is the quote unquote right rhythm. If we could see a cinematic montage made from precise documents representing in a few minutes the evolution of man from his simian ancestors, the progressive cephalization, the upright posture from quadrupedal walking, the changing appearance of the face and gaze, it is highly likely that quote unquote meaningful interpretations of evolution would gain many followers. Even positivists perhaps would attach less importance to the fact that accumulated mutations appear to explain step by step the appearance of man. These mutations, inserted into the overall appearance, would no longer seem to be anything more than subordinate means. In the 19th century, people often believed that they could erase the differences in nature between things or sufficiently account for their specificity by, quote-unquote, drowning them in a very slow evolution. It took the entire arsenal of phenomenology to escape this prejudice. Meanings and ends often appear only at the cost of a systematic disregard for details and subordinate means. Just as ruins, almost erased by sand, are unrecognized by pedestrian travelers and revealed only by aerial photography, just as there is no beauty in a painting for one who looks at it through a microscope, or there is no human beauty for Gulliver in Brobdingnag. Likewise, there is no meaningful information for a Gulliver of time who adopts an inappropriate rhythm. Right, so here, so he's essentially suggesting that in the capacity of a conscious being like a human to sort of understand, to grasp the end of something, of some process of another person's behavior, for example. The fact that we can sort of grasp the end based on the early stages of this process, like you can say, I don't know, see that someone is trying to climb a ladder, even though they're only on the first rung. So you can sort of understand the goal just by observing the person's behavior. This is a kind of like ideal reversal of time in the sense that we are sort of grasping the end point of the process and then like traveling back in time, ideally, like not in a real series of time, but we're traveling back from this ideal end state back to the present and then understanding the link between these two, or the process that leads from one to the other. And he points out, of course, that this sort of perception of a goal and or of a process as goal directed is very dependent on the speed of the process that we're perceiving. And the bit about plants here is pretty interesting, because I know that this exact method is something that that like botanists have started using. That you just film plants over the course of a day or many hours, and then you just run the recording at a higher speed. Because of course, if you just look at a plant, with the naked eye, it doesn't really seem to be doing anything, or it might sort of rustle in the wind or whatever, but it doesn't seem to have any kind of active, interaction with the world. It just seems to be sort of pushed around by the forces that are affecting it. But then when you watch the sped up film, you can see some of the famous examples, of course, are like sunflowers that turn to track the sun throughout the course of a day. So here, it's not there isn't just sort of a sort of passive force pushing the sunflower, to turn in a certain direction, but there's some kind of process internal to the sunflower which makes it turn the flower to face the sun. And so this is obviously a very simple kind of goal-directed behavior, but there's other more complex ones that plants engage in. So like the growth of the roots of a plant is a kind of like exploration of the soil, and there are like different resources that the plant needs. Like it needs water, of course, but different trace elements in the soil, and so the plant is sort of integrating information coming in about like which direction seems to have more water, which direction seems to have more of nutrient A or nutrient B, etc. It sort of integrates all this information, and then we would sort of say that it's making a decision about which direction the root should grow to, what's the optimal direction given the current needs for these different resources and the information that's available about which direction is sort of the most promising one to grow in. And so if you just sort of map this root growth process at a much higher speed than the like millimeters per day that the real time process is occurring in, then it looks a lot like some sort of animal exploring a territory looking for food, for example. So yeah, if we in the case of a squirrel going around, we would like very easily attribute this sort of intention of finding food, or something analogous to the human intention of finding food, to this squirrel, and then the plant roots are doing something quite similar if you just speed it up. So it seems like it's just as valid to attribute an intention to the plants as it is to the squirrel. But here, it's just because the plants are living at such a slow pace compared to us that it's hard for us to even like see it as a purposive, as goal-directed behavior. And yeah, just this relatively simple technological device of speeding up the recording sort of makes that goal-directedness apparent to us where it wasn't before. Okay, so we can go on to the next bit. Angus, would you be able to read from Machines and the Present?
Yeah, for sure. Machines in the Present. Let us return to Wiener's thesis on the time of information. 19th century physiology drew inspiration from heat engines and considered organisms as natural automata, as machines that burn sugars and fats. It was the energetic balance, or the balance of the metabolism, that mainly attracted its attention. But today, physiology is mainly interested in operations carried out at a low energy level, as in electronic tubes, where what matters is not the energy balance, but the fidelity with which messages are reproduced or used. It no longer draws inspiration solely from thermodynamics, but from the physical theory of communication. It considers organisms as automata coupled with the outside world, not only through their energy flow, their metabolism, but through the flow of impressions, messages arriving and departing. The receiving organs of automata are, and their effector organs are equivalent to the muscular system. Between these two kinds of mechanisms, between the input and the output of machines, Others have the function, like the central nervous system, of storing information, rules of action, and of controlling the effectors according to perception of the results already obtained. Wiener concludes that time in automata, whether natural or manufactured, has an even clearer meaning than in heat engine. It is impossible to interchange incoming messages and outgoing messages, and it is also impossible to imagine the functioning of an automaton that would have pre-images or whose memory would precede incoming messages, just as it is impossible to imagine a living being that knows its future and not its past. It is therefore clear that the input-output relationship is in a one-way time and implies a defined past-future, passé avenir, order. Quote, thus, the modern automaton exists in the same sort of Bergsonian time as the living, and hence there is no reason in Bergson's considerations why the essential mode of functioning of the living organism should not be the same as the automaton of this type. We have acknowledged that the line of the present doesn't pass between the quote-unquote input and the quote-unquote output information machine, and more generally is fixed by the ongoing functioning machine auxiliary to an action. Only a functioning machine can fix the present with precision. It seems strange at first glance to draw such a metaphysical dividing line between the quote-unquote input and quote-unquote output of machine. But to convince oneself, it is enough to look around without prejudice. At this precise moment, the tip of my pen, controlled by my hand, is depositing ink on my page, writing a sentence according to a psychic setup that itself responds to the meaning I want to express and that aims for a truth. Truth, meaning, and even the sentence that wants to express it are temporally, quote-unquote, spread out. Truth even completely transcends time. But the tip of my pen operates in a very precise present. Cars pass in the street. Every fraction of a second, a spark automatically ignites, causing the gasoline to explode and pushing the piston in order to carry the driver of the car to a specific place, responding to a psychological intention enveloped by a larger quote-unquote ideal. Birds sing in the trees of the square. Their larynx operates in the rigorous present of sound vibrations according to an instinctive impulse, much more liberated from time in which itself responds to some vital intention as old as the world. Even pedestrians do not move without an interposed machine. Their intention to go somewhere, to accomplish something, envelops the action of a subconscious quote-unquote task that itself envelops the physiological functions and the chronologically rigorous mechanism of a series of controlled falls. An ideal line of the present only intersects activity punctually through machines. Without machines, the actual would be a specious present of variable magnitude, depending on the degree of embodiment of the activity. Since that was a short, maybe we can just stop and discuss it first. He seems to be partially agreeing with Wiener here, that there are, as we've discussed, anatomical and physiological components that can be understood as machines, and even psychophysiological sets, like writing by hand, example that Ruyer gives, and which operate in and kind of maybe define the present by their operation. And this is true of cybernetic automata, but also of living beings. But I think he's disagreeing with Wiener that for this reason, the automaton exists in Bergsonian time, as Wiener puts it, because, and I think he'll go into this in more detail in the next section, but there needs to be some kind of absolute survey in order to order the time of purely mechanical activity as kind of before or after or simultaneous. So in this case, the meaning of the sentence in Ruyer's mind is kind of the order of, and in a sense, the unity of the physical or mechanical action of writing the sentence, just as the instinct is something like the order or the virtual form of the mechanical aspects of the bird song. And I think that for the automata, there is kind of only the step-by-step present moment without that kind of the sequence of those steps being held together in any overarching order in some conscious survey.
Yeah, maybe I'll make one sort of side comment here before getting into the actual sort of arguments in this passage. He mentions birds and he uses the term larynx, but birds actually do not have a larynx. They have a different organ called a syrinx. A bird's vocal apparatus is completely different than mammals, including humans, which makes it even more kind of surprising that you have birds like parrots that can approximate human speech like in at least a comprehensible way, because yeah, their whole sort of system of vocal organs is completely different than humans. That's not that important. So yeah, here he's talking about these, so Wiener has sort of presented the idea that these information machines that, have this clear sort of input, output order, there's some sort of input, there's some sort of processing going on within the machine, and then there's some sort of output, that this would be a kind of Bergsonian machine in the sense that there's like an order of time, this sort of intrinsic order of time from past, present to future. And Ruyer he thinks there's something to this idea, but he's of course going to say it's overly limited, or that it has a sort of limited applicability. But he in this passage I think is pretty interesting because he suggests here that what is sort of characteristic of the present as like a specific moment is the fact that all these different machines all sort of line up in this one moment. So each process that we can look at, for example, like he talks about walking. Walking involves a variety of different mechanisms in the human body. Our legs are levers of some kind. The muscular contractions are chemical machines and so on. And yeah, so this process is of course directed in some sense by our nervous system. Of course, as adults who have sort of normally functioning nervous systems and all our limbs intact, that we are capable of walking as a kind of automatic process. We don't have to like think about how to move our legs to be able to walk. So there's a kind of like walking machine set up in our nervous system that can just be executed. But then of course usually when we walk we have some sort of intention, even if the intention is just to go for a walk. But often it's I want to walk to the store to buy X or whatever. But in any case there's a kind of psychological high level sort of conceptual articulation of what it is exactly that we're trying to do, the purpose of the walk, even if it's just enjoying the activity of walking, that's also an intention. And then that sort of abstract intention gets kind of incarnated into this realization, this like actualization of this walking pattern that is has been built up in our nervous system through our learning process when we were infants and so on. But of course this process of realization of going from the intention, it's a nice day, I want to enjoy a walk, to the actual action of this leg moving at this time, that process is not sort of occurring in a vacuum. That like actualization of the intention of going for a walk is occurring simultaneously with all kinds of metabolic processes going on in your body, where like what you had for lunch is being digested and the nutrients are being used to power your muscles as you go for your walk. You're hearing the birds singing, and there's all kinds of processes going on within those birds that are producing sounds, etc. Like all these other billions of machines are also operating the whole sort of actualization process through which some ideal gets realized in a machine. There are billions of other instances of those processes going on around you all the time. And so when we talk about the present, it's not just one point in one of these actualization processes. It's like this coordination of all these sort of actualization processes with each other. What point are each of these processes at at this moment? And so he suggests here that if it weren't for these machines, it would be kind of arbitrary what scale we wanted to look at when we talk about the present. So this is this term specious present, um, which comes I think it's William James who introduces this term. But like in psychology, when you sort of try to get people to sort of report what exactly now means, or like what is the duration of now, or when is now not now anymore, etc. Of course, there's like a certain duration, a few fractions of a second that is sort of below the threshold of awareness, or the threshold of like what we experience as a distinct moment. But that can also vary depending on what exactly it is that you're observing. If it's like a like a sound, like a sort of short, sharp sound, you can, for example, experience a very short duration sound as now, as this striking of the of a drum is happening now. Um, but if it's a sound like, say, a violin, you can't really using a bow, for example, not plucked, but like bowing a violin, you can't really experience the now of the violin note in the same sort of short duration as striking a drum. The sort of now of hearing a violin is broader, is of longer duration than the now of hearing a drum being struck. And then of course you can expand this sort of arbitrarily. You can say like the now of like this period of my life, now equals high school or something. Um, and there's a kind of like zooming in and out depending on what purpose you have for treating a certain segment of time as now versus as being composed of a past, a present, future extension. And so he is suggesting that it's only this sort of actualization into machines, or the presence of machines, that makes it not arbitrary to what we want to count as now, because the now the point of my sort of idea actualization path, that is the moment that I'm sitting at the desk writing this sentence, is the same moment that I'm hearing the car drive by outside and the birds sing outside, etc. Like this exact point of the actualization of that writing this sentence ideal is sort of synchronized with all these other actualization processes, and so it's not just arbitrary how far I want to zoom in and out, or how wide I want to cast my net of what I count as the present. I think that's a pretty interesting idea. Yeah, it just sort of, it's a different angle on what it is we're talking about when we talk about the present and time. And you can even, I guess, connect this to some of the questions that come about as a result of the theory of relativity, where before Einstein, of course, what exactly we mean when we say that two distant events are simultaneous with each other was not really thought about in a very careful way. That the concept of simultaneous just seemed sort of obvious, but then if you think about, like, if it takes a certain amount of time for a message to get from where this other event happened to me, what exactly do I mean by simultaneous, given that there's this time difference in the message reaching me? Like, do I mean simultaneous with when the message reaches me, or like somehow removing the time it took the message to reach me, etc. Anyway, so once you start thinking about that carefully, then and combined with the constancy of the speed of light, then you end up with special relativity.
Yeah, the point about the present and the functioning or synchronizing of a lot of machines is very interesting. I don't fully understand how it. So in either the next section or the following, one of the sections in this chapter, he talks about how simultaneity requires a kind of consciousness for which two events can be simultaneous. And he argues against kind of in a similar vein, argues against a purely physical arrow of time, on the basis that you need kind of an intuition of time in order to say that one event precedes another or follows another. And I mean, the point about the present sort of being defined by a lot of machines working together in a highly complex way, in I guess maybe sort of the same light cone, that makes sense to me intuitively, but I don't really understand how, I guess, what the consciousness is that is supposed to be contracting this present, such that the action of all of these machines is simultaneous, or if you would distinguish between presence and simultaneity, so that you could maybe, in principle, have a lot of synchronized mechanical activity happening in the same present, but that it would not be kind of simultaneous in a conscious sense. I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, I mean, given some of the examples that he's pointing to here, like the car engine, for example, like if I'm just sitting at my desk writing, and I hear a car drive by, I hear just sort of like a, I don't know, rumble noise or whatever. But he points out that this car driving by noise is being produced by this spark in the piston that is igniting, and the piston going up and down, and this is happening many times per second. Of course, I don't actually hear like spark igniting and piston going up and down 40,000 times a second or whatever it is. I just hear this sort of rumble sound. So I mean, and that's, maybe you can connect this to like the Leibniz thing about how we have this obscure perception of every drop in the ocean when we hear the waves crashing on the shore. So it seemed like the machine here, in the very literal sense, the machine of the car's piston moving up and down, being simultaneous with these other machines that are bringing about the actualization of maybe the thoughts that I have that I want to write, and the movements of my hand that bring about that writing process. The simultaneity or synchronization between these processes is not itself something that I'm conscious of, because I, of course, am not conscious of the movements of the piston in this car in the first place. So it seems like this synchronization of these various machines is not necessarily something that is like present to any one consciousness.
Yeah, and I guess it's for Ruyer, because of his very broad understanding of consciousness. I don't know if he would argue that kind of on some level, for every form that there is in even like at the subatomic level, at this moment when you're sitting at the desk writing and hear the car, if there's a kind of absolute survey or simultaneity for each of these forms, that is more or less coordinated somehow with all of the others, which sounds a lot like Leibniz, I guess, now that I'm saying it.
Yeah, I guess the question is whether there's like a monad of the monads, like God for Leibniz. Not sure if Rie ever really addresses whether there's like a form of the universe in his sense, like a sort of universal, overarching form in which all these other forms would be present. Maybe he talks about this point somewhere, but I don't think I've encountered that yet. Okay, so we started a bit late today, but we're at the 2-hour mark from the starting point. So I suggest we stop here for now, because I know it's late for you, Angus. I think next week should be good for me. I'm sorry, let me just take a look. Yeah, next week should be good. I am going to be missing one in a few weeks, but there should be, the next few should be fine.
Okay, that sounds great. Yeah, thanks, Nan. Thanks, 61. Talk to you.